As the Second World War came to a close in 1945, the world celebrated a hard-won victory over the Axis powers. Yet, amidst the celebrations, a new and ominous chapter of global history began to unfold. A chapter defined by fear, rivalry, and ideological conflict. The Cold War was born, not with the clash of armies on battlefields, but with the quiet tension that grew between two superpowers whose visions for the future could not have been more different. On one side stood the United States, a nation rooted in democracy and capitalism. Its leaders believed in the principles of free markets, individual freedoms, and open political systems. On the other side was the Soviet Union, a communist state built on the principles of Marxism-Leninism, where the government controlled both the economy and political life. These two nations had been allies in the fight against Nazi Germany, but their alliance was one of necessity, not trust. As soon as the war ended, their differences came to the surface, and the stage was set for nearly half a century of tension and conflict. The Cold War was unlike any other conflict in history. It was not fought with traditional armies or open warfare, but rather with espionage, propaganda, proxy wars, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. At its heart was an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, with both sides seeking to expand their influence across the globe. The fear of mutually assured destruction, MAID, kept the superpowers from engaging in direct military conflict, but their rivalry played out in other ways, through space races, arms races, and political maneuvering. In this journey, we will explore how the Cold War began, the key events that defined it, and the individuals who shaped its course. We will travel from the tense negotiations at the end of World War II to the construction of the Berlin Wall, through the terrifying days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and finally to the fall of the Soviet Union. Though the Cold War never erupted into full-scale conflict, its shadow looms large over modern history. As we embark on this peaceful journey through time, allow the story of the Cold War to guide you into a restful state, with the knowledge that this chapter of history ended not in destruction, but in the hope of a new era of peace. Chapter 1. The Iron Curtain Descends. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Cities had been bombed into rubble, economies were shattered, and millions of people were displaced. Amidst the devastation, two powers emerged as the dominant forces in global politics, the United States and the Soviet Union. The wartime alliance between these two nations was based solely on their shared goal of defeating Nazi Germany. But once that goal was achieved, their underlying ideological differences came to the forefront. As early as 1946, it became clear that Europe was being divided into two distinct spheres of influence. In the West, the United States and its allies worked to rebuild democratic governments and capitalist economies, supported by American financial aid through the Marshall Plan. In the East, the Soviet Union tightened its grip on the countries it had liberated from Nazi control, installing communist regimes loyal to Moscow. The division was not just political, but deeply ideological, as the West promoted freedom and capitalism, while the East embraced communism and state control. It was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill who first gave a name to this growing divide. In a speech delivered in March 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. This Iron Curtain was not a physical barrier, at least not yet, but rather a metaphor for the stark division between the free, democratic nations of the West and the communist regimes of the East. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, Europe was now divided into two hostile camps. Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union solidified its control over Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany were brought into the Soviet sphere of influence through a combination of political pressure, military force, and the installation of puppet governments. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, viewed this expansion as essential to the security of the Soviet Union, which had been invaded by Germany twice in the first half of the 20th century. By creating a buffer zone of friendly communist states, Stalin believed he could protect the Soviet Union from future threats. In response to Soviet expansion, the United States adopted a policy known as containment. Articulated by American diplomat George Kennan, containment was the idea that the spread of communism needed to be halted by any means necessary. The U.S. would not directly confront the Soviet Union with military force, but it would work to prevent the spread of communism to other countries. This policy was first put into action with the Truman Doctrine, announced by President Harry S. Truman in 1947. The Truman Doctrine pledged American support to countries threatened by communist insurgencies, beginning with Greece and Turkey. The divide between East and West became even more pronounced with the creation of military alliances. In 1949, the United States and its Western European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a defensive alliance aimed at deterring Soviet aggression. In response, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Creating a formal military alliance between the communist states. Europe was now firmly divided, with two powerful blocs staring each other down across the Iron Curtain. But the Iron Curtain was not just a division between governments. It was a barrier between peoples, families, and cultures. In countries like Germany, families found themselves separated by the division between East and West. As the Cold War deepened, this division would become more concrete, culminating in the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. The Iron Curtain would come to define life in Europe for decades, as millions of people lived under the shadow of Soviet control, while those in the West watched with growing unease. The descent of the Iron Curtain marked the beginning of a long period of tension between East and West. As we move forward in our journey through the Cold War, we will explore how this division played out in conflicts around the world, from the proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam to the nuclear arms race that threatened to destroy everything. But for now, allow yourself to rest, knowing that even in the darkest days of the Cold War, there were always voices calling for peace. Chapter 2. The Nuclear Arms Race and Mutually Assured Destruction. As the 1940s drew to a close, the world entered a new and terrifying era, the age of nuclear weapons. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 had demonstrated the unimaginable destructive power of nuclear technology, and both the United States and the Soviet Union were determined to build their own arsenals of these devastating weapons. Thus began the nuclear arms race, one of the most dangerous and defining aspects of the Cold War. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, shattering the United States' monopoly on nuclear weapons. The world now had two nuclear-armed superpowers, and the stakes of the Cold War grew exponentially higher. Both nations embarked on a rapid buildup of nuclear weapons, driven by the fear that the other side might gain a decisive advantage. The guiding principle of this arms race was mutually assured destruction, MADI. The idea that if either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate with such force that both nations would be destroyed. MAD may have prevented a full-scale nuclear war, but it created a constant undercurrent of fear and anxiety. The sheer scale of the nuclear buildup was staggering. By the early 1960s, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union possessed thousands of nuclear warheads, capable of being launched from land-based missiles, submarines, and strategic bombers. The threat of nuclear annihilation hung over every major political decision, and ordinary citizens lived with the knowledge that their world could be destroyed in an instant. The arms race was not just about numbers, it was also about technological superiority. In the 1950s and 1960s, both superpowers developed hydrogen bombs, weapons far more powerful than the atomic bombs used in World War II. They also raced to develop delivery systems capable of striking anywhere in the world. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, meant that a nuclear war could be fought from one side of the globe to the other, with missiles flying thousands of miles in a matter of minutes. Throughout the arms race, both sides engaged in elaborate tests and displays of military might. Nuclear tests were conducted in remote deserts and isolated atolls, with massive explosions lighting up the sky and leaving behind eerie, radioactive landscapes. These tests were designed not just to develop new weapons, but to send a message to the other side. We are prepared for nuclear war. But despite the saber-rattling, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union understood that a nuclear war would have no winners, only survivors, if even that. The arms race also had a profound impact on popular culture. In both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, nuclear anxiety seeped into movies, books, and music. Films like Dr. Strangelove and On the Beach captured the dark humor and existential dread of living under the constant threat of nuclear war. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills, designed to teach them how to survive a nuclear blast, though most people knew that such measures would be of little help in the event of a real attack. Despite the ever-present danger of nuclear war, there were moments of hope. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers engaged in arms control negotiations, seeking to limit the spread and use of nuclear weapons. The first major agreement came in 1963 with the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space. This was followed by a series of arms control agreements, including the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, in the 1970s, and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, Treaty in the 1980s. While the nuclear arms race defined much of the Cold War, it was also a reminder of the fragility of human civilization. The knowledge that a single miscalculation or accident could lead to the destruction of the world kept both sides from pushing too far. And so, as the world lived in the shadow of nuclear weapons, both superpowers engaged in a delicate balancing act, hoping to avoid the ultimate catastrophe. Chapter 3: The Korean War and Proxy Conflicts. As the Cold War deepened in the late 1940s and early 1950s, it became clear that the ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union would not be confined to Europe. Instead of direct confrontation between the superpowers, the Cold War would be fought through a series of proxy wars, conflicts in which the U.S. and Soviet Union supported opposing sides, often in smaller, less developed countries. These proxy wars would become a defining feature of the Cold War, allowing the superpowers to compete for influence without risking direct military engagement. The first major proxy conflict of the Cold War erupted on the Korean Peninsula in 1950. Korea, which had been occupied by Japan during World War II, was divided along the 38th parallel at the war's end, with Soviet forces occupying the north and American forces occupying the south. What was intended to be a temporary division quickly hardened into a permanent one, as both the U.S. and the Soviet Union set up rival governments in their respective zones of influence. In the north, a communist government was established under Kim Il-sung, while the South became a capitalist state under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. The division of Korea mirrored the broader global divide between East and West. But the situation took a violent turn in June 1950, when North Korean forces, backed by Soviet and Chinese support, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. The invasion caught the U.S. and its allies off guard, and within weeks, the North Korean army had pushed deep into South Korean territory, threatening to overrun the entire peninsula. In response, the United Nations, led by the United States, launched a military intervention to defend South Korea. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, U.S. and UN forces mounted a daring counteroffensive, landing at Incheon and pushing the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the war might end with the reunification of Korea under a U.S.-backed government. But as UN forces advanced toward the Chinese border, China entered the conflict, sending hundreds of thousands of troops to support the North Koreans. The war quickly turned into a brutal and bloody stalemate, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The Korean War was a devastating conflict, with millions of soldiers and civilians killed or wounded. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and the Korean peninsula was left deeply scarred by the fighting. In 1953, after 3 years of intense combat, an armistice was signed, bringing an end to the fighting but not to the war itself. The Korean peninsula remained divided along the 38th parallel, and to this day, North and South Korea remain technically at war. The Korean War was significant not only because of the devastation it caused, but also because it marked the first time the Cold War had turned into a hot conflict. It set the stage for future proxy wars, where the superpowers would avoid direct confrontation but support opposing sides in regional conflicts. For the United States, the Korean War was a key moment in its policy of containment. The belief that communism had to be stopped from spreading to other parts of the world. For the Soviet Union and China, the war was a critical moment in their efforts to expand communist influence in Asia. The Korean War also had lasting effects on global politics. It led to the formal establishment of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, which remains a cornerstone of American foreign policy in Asia. It also solidified the division of the Korean peninsula, a division that continues to shape regional tensions to this day. Meanwhile, the war helped to legitimize the United Nations as a force for collective security, although its ability to prevent future conflicts would remain limited. Beyond Korea, the Cold War saw the rise of other proxy conflicts, many of which were fought in the developing world. In places like Greece, Turkey, and Iran, the U.S. and Soviet Union backed opposing sides in civil wars, coups, and insurgencies, each hoping to expand its influence. These conflicts, though often overshadowed by the larger events of the Cold War, were nonetheless crucial in shaping the global balance of power. Chapter 4: The Berlin Crisis and the Building of the Wall. As the Cold War intensified, the city of Berlin became a focal point of East-West tensions. Berlin was not only a symbolic battleground between the ideologies of capitalism and communism, but also a literal one, as the city was divided between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The unique status of Berlin, located deep within East Germany but split into zones controlled by the U.S., Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, made it a flashpoint for Cold War conflict. In 1948, just a few years after the end of World War II, the first major crisis in Berlin erupted when the Soviet Union attempted to cut off access to the city's western sectors. This event, known as the Berlin Blockade, was a response to the Western powers' decision to introduce a new currency in West Germany, a move the Soviets saw as a threat to their control of the eastern half of the country. In response, the Soviets blocked all road, rail, and water access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Allies to abandon the city. Rather than retreat, the U.S. and its allies launched an extraordinary effort to keep West Berlin supplied. For nearly a year, cargo planes flew round-the-clock missions, delivering food, fuel, and other essential supplies to the beleaguered city. The Berlin Airlift, as it became known, was a remarkable feat of logistics and determination. It demonstrated the West's commitment to defending Berlin and sent a clear message to the Soviet Union that the division of Europe would not be easily undone. The Berlin blockade ended in 1949, but the tensions surrounding the city did not. Throughout the 1950s, East Germans grew increasingly disillusioned with life under communist rule. East Germany, like much of the Soviet bloc, struggled with economic stagnation, political repression, and limited personal freedoms. In contrast, West Berlin offered a window into the prosperity and freedom of the West. As a result, thousands of East Germans began fleeing to the West, using Berlin as their escape route. By 1961, nearly 3.5 million East Germans had crossed into West Berlin and defected to the West, a trend that was deeply embarrassing for the East German government and the Soviet Union. In response to this exodus, East Germany, with Soviet approval, took drastic action. On the night of August 13, 1961, construction began on a physical barrier that would come to symbolize the entire Cold War, the Berlin Wall. Initially, the wall was little more than a barbed wire fence, but over time it was fortified with concrete walls, guard towers, and a death strip patrolled by armed soldiers. The Berlin Wall cut off East Berlin from West Berlin, effectively sealing off the last route of escape for East Germans seeking freedom in the West. The construction of the Berlin Wall shocked the world. Families were torn apart, as those who lived on opposite sides of the wall found themselves separated with no way to reunite. The wall became a stark symbol of the division between East and West, communism and capitalism. While the Soviet Union and East Germany claimed the wall was necessary to prevent Western spies and agents from infiltrating the East, it was clear to the world that its real purpose was to keep the people of East Germany from fleeing. For the next 28 years, the Berlin Wall would stand as the most visible representation of the Cold War. The wall was a constant reminder of the ideological divide that had split Europe, and it became a focal point for protests, both in the East and the West. Western leaders, including U.S. President John F. Kennedy, visited the wall to show solidarity with the people of West Berlin. In his famous speech in 1963, Kennedy declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner, reaffirming America's commitment to defending the freedom of the city. Life on either side of the Berlin Wall was vastly different. In the West, Berliners enjoyed the freedoms and economic prosperity of capitalist society. In the East, life was marked by state control, limited freedoms, and the constant presence of the secret police. While East Berliners were often told that the wall was protecting them from Western aggression, Many saw it for what it was, a prison wall, keeping them from the opportunities and freedoms that lay just a few miles away. Despite the wall's presence, East Germans continued to resist. Some attempted daring escapes, tunneling under the wall or climbing over it at great personal risk. Others found ways to resist the regime more quietly, through acts of civil disobedience and protest. The Berlin Wall may have been a powerful symbol of division, but it also became a symbol of defiance. East Germans who sought freedom and a better life continually challenged the wall's existence. Some dug tunnels beneath it, while others used homemade hot air balloons, speeding cars, or hidden compartments in vehicles to flee to the west. These stories of escape captured the world's attention and demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit. Over time, the Berlin Wall became the physical manifestation of the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. It divided not only Berlin but also families, friendships, and hopes for a unified Germany. Despite the increasing sophistication of the wall's defenses, people continued to dream of a world where the wall no longer existed, and they could freely move between East and West without fear of repression. As the Cold War progressed, the division of Berlin and the existence of the wall remained a focal point of East-West tensions. The wall stood as a reminder of the stark differences between life in the communist bloc and the democratic West. It was a literal barrier, but also a symbol of the barriers erected between human beings during this prolonged ideological conflict. In 1989, after nearly 3 decades of separation, the unthinkable happened. The peaceful revolutions sweeping through Eastern Europe led to the opening of borders, and the people of East Berlin, inspired by movements in Poland, Hungary, and other nations, began demanding the right to cross into West Berlin. On November 9, 1989, under immense pressure, the East German government announced that its citizens would be allowed to cross the border freely. Thousands of people rushed to the wall, where they were met by equally excited West Berliners. In an outpouring of joy and celebration, people began to dismantle the wall with hammers and chisels, piece by piece. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. It was a moment of triumph for the people of Berlin, and a symbolic victory for the democratic ideals that had been defended for so long. The reunification of Germany soon followed, and with it, the unification of Europe under the banner of peace and cooperation. The Berlin Wall's collapse demonstrated that even the most seemingly permanent divisions can be overcome. It was a powerful reminder that, while walls can be built to divide people, they can also be torn down when the desire for freedom, unity, and peace is strong enough. Chapter 5. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Brinkmanship at its peak. The early 1960s brought one of the most terrifying moments of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, for 13 days, the world held its breath as the United States and the Soviet Union teetered on the brink of nuclear war. It was the closest the superpowers would ever come to a full-scale conflict, and the crisis remains one of the most dramatic examples of Cold War brinkmanship, the practice of pushing dangerous events to the edge of disaster in the hope of securing the best possible outcome. The seeds of the crisis were planted when Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba in 1959. Castro's revolution overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, and his government quickly aligned itself with the Soviet Union. The U.S. government, alarmed by the presence of a communist regime just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, responded by severing diplomatic ties with Cuba and imposing a trade embargo. In April 1961, the U.S. launched a failed attempt to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion, an event that deepened tensions between Cuba and the United States and pushed Castro further into the Soviet sphere of influence. For Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Cuba represented both an opportunity and a strategic vulnerability. The Soviet Union had long been at a disadvantage in the nuclear arms race, particularly in terms of its ability to strike the United States with long-range missiles. While the U.S. had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey, just across the Black Sea from the Soviet Union, the Soviets lacked a comparable position near U.S. territory. By placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, Khrushchev hoped to level the playing field, and perhaps more importantly, to deter any future U.S. invasions of the island. In the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union secretly began shipping nuclear missiles and military equipment to Cuba. The construction of missile sites on the island was carried out in great secrecy, but on October 14th, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane captured photographic evidence of Soviet missile installations under construction. The discovery sent shockwaves through the U.S. government, as President John F. Kennedy and his advisors realized that Soviet missiles, capable of carrying nuclear warheads, were just days away from becoming operational, putting much of the U.S. mainland within striking distance. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised broadcast, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing a naval quarantine of the island. The use of the term quarantine was deliberate. Calling it a blockade could have been interpreted as an act of war. Kennedy demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles and halt all further shipments of military equipment to Cuba. At the same time, he warned that any nuclear attack launched from Cuba would be met with a full-scale retaliatory response against the Soviet Union. The next few days were marked by tense negotiations, as both sides sought to avoid a catastrophic war while protecting their strategic interests. Soviet ships carrying additional missiles approached the U.S. naval blockade, and there were moments when it seemed that military confrontation was inevitable. In Washington, Kennedy's advisors debated the possibility of a military strike against the missile sites in Cuba, but they also recognized the enormous risk of escalation. Behind the scenes, diplomacy was taking place through secret channels. In a series of tense communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev, both leaders sought a way out of the crisis. Khrushchev, aware of the devastating consequences of a nuclear war, eventually agreed to a deal. On October 28th, he announced that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. Secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey, though this part of the deal was not made public at the time. With the agreement in place, the crisis was averted, and the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the Cold War to the brink of nuclear disaster, but it also marked a turning point. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union realized just how fragile the balance of power was, and the near disaster led to efforts to reduce the risk of future nuclear confrontations. In the wake of the crisis, a direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow, allowing for immediate communication between the leaders of the two superpowers. This hotline was a symbol of the lessons learned from the crisis, that even in the most dangerous moments, diplomacy and communication were essential to maintaining peace. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a sobering reminder of the devastating potential of nuclear weapons and the thin line between peace and war in the Cold War era. The world had narrowly avoided a catastrophe, and the crisis would influence U.S. and Soviet leaders for the rest of the Cold War, shaping their approach to arms control and diplomacy. Chapter 6. The Space Race, From Sputnik to the Moon. The Cold War was not only fought on Earth, it was also waged in the vast reaches of space. The space race, as it came to be known, was a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to achieve dominance in space exploration. While it was motivated by the scientific curiosity and national pride of both superpowers, the space race was also a key part of the Cold War rivalry. The technological advancements required for space exploration had clear military applications, particularly in the development of missile technology, and the success or failure of each side's space programs became a powerful symbol of national prestige. The space race began in earnest in 1957, when the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit. Sputnik was a small spherical satellite, just over 20 inches in diameter, with 4 long antennae that broadcast a simple radio signal as it orbited the Earth. But its impact was immense. The launch of Sputnik marked the beginning of the space age and demonstrated that the Soviet Union had developed powerful rocket technology capable of launching payloads into space, and, by implication, delivering nuclear warheads across continents. In the United States, the reaction to Sputnik was one of shock and fear. The launch suggested that the Soviet Union had surpassed the U.S. in the critical area of missile technology, and the American public, already anxious about the threat of nuclear war, was deeply concerned that the U.S. had fallen behind. In response, the U.S. government launched a massive effort to catch up with the Soviets in space technology. This effort included the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958, as well as increased funding for science and math education to produce the engineers and scientists needed for the space program. The early years of the space race were dominated by Soviet successes. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space, orbiting the Earth in the spacecraft Vostok 1. Gagarin's flight was a triumph for the Soviet Union and a major propaganda victory, showcasing Soviet technological prowess and cementing Gagarin's status as a national hero. For the U.S., Gagarin's flight was another wake-up call, spurring even greater efforts to overtake the Soviet Union in space. In May 1961, just weeks after Gagarin's flight, U.S. President John F. Kennedy delivered a speech that would set the stage for the most ambitious goal of the space race: sending a man to the moon. Speaking before a joint session of Congress, Kennedy declared, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." This bold promise captured the imagination of the American public and set NASA on a course that would culminate in one of the greatest achievements in human history. Over the next several years, NASA embarked on a series of increasingly complex missions, testing new technologies and building the infrastructure needed for a moon landing. The Mercury program, which included the first American manned spaceflight by astronaut Alan Shepard in 1961, was followed by the Gemini program, which conducted long-duration spaceflights and practiced the docking and maneuvering techniques that would be essential for a lunar mission. By the late 1960s, the stage was set for the final chapter of the space race. The Apollo program, launched by NASA in 1961, aimed to fulfill Kennedy's vision of landing an astronaut on the moon. After several successful test missions, Apollo 11 was launched on July 16, 1969. The spacecraft carried astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins on a journey to the Moon, a journey watched by millions of people around the world. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the Moon, speaking the famous words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Armstrong and Aldrin spent several hours exploring the lunar surface, conducting experiments, and collecting samples, while Collins remained in orbit aboard the command module. The successful landing of Apollo 11 fulfilled Kennedy's promise and marked a monumental achievement for the U.S. space program. The moon landing was not only a triumph for NASA, but also a symbolic victory in the Cold War. While the Soviet Union had achieved many firsts in space, including the first satellite and the first human in space, it was the United States that had reached the moon. The space race, which had begun as a contest of technology and prestige, had become a powerful demonstration of American innovation and determination. In the years that followed, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union continued to explore space, but the fierce competition of the early space race began to give way to cooperation. In 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project marked the first international spaceflight, as American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit, and astronauts and cosmonauts shook hands in space. The mission symbolized a thaw in Cold War tensions and pointed to the possibility of future collaboration in space exploration. Chapter 7: Vietnam and the Global Cold War. As the Cold War stretched into the 1960s and 1970s, the ideological battle between communism and capitalism spread beyond Europe and the Americas, reaching the jungles of Southeast Asia. Nowhere was this more evident than in Vietnam, where a brutal and protracted conflict unfolded, a war that not only divided a nation, but also became a global symbol of the Cold War's devastating impact on countries caught between the superpower struggle. The origins of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the aftermath of World War II. After Japan's defeat in 1945, Vietnam, a former French colony, sought independence under the leadership of the communist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh. However, France, determined to maintain its colonial empire, refused to grant independence, leading to the First Indochina War between French forces and the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh's nationalist and communist guerrilla fighters. By 1954, France, exhausted by the conflict, agreed to the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam into two parts along the 17th parallel: the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South, supported by the United States. This division set the stage for a new chapter in the Cold War. The U.S., deeply committed to its policy of containing communism, viewed the situation in Vietnam as part of the larger global struggle. The fear was that if Vietnam fell to communism, other nations in Southeast Asia, like dominoes, would soon follow. This domino theory became a driving force behind U.S. involvement in Vietnam. In the late 1950s, tensions between North and South Vietnam escalated as the Communist North sought to reunify the country under its control, while the South, backed by the U.S., resisted. The U.S. began sending military advisors to help the South Vietnamese government, but the situation deteriorated as communist insurgents, known as the Viet Cong, gained strength in the South. By the early 1960s, it was clear that South Vietnam could not hold out without significant American intervention. In 1965, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson escalated American involvement by sending ground troops to Vietnam. What began as a limited advisory mission soon transformed into a full-scale war, with hundreds of thousands of American soldiers deployed to fight the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. The war became a grueling and complex conflict, fought in dense jungles, rice paddies, and remote villages. The Viet Cong, skilled in guerrilla warfare, used hit-and-run tactics and the cover of the thick jungle to their advantage, making it difficult for the U.S. to achieve a decisive victory. The Vietnam War was unlike any previous conflict. It was a war of attrition, with no clear front lines and no easily defined victories. The U.S. military's overwhelming firepower and advanced technology, including the use of napalm and Agent Orange to destroy jungle cover, could not overcome the determination of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. For the U.S., the war became a costly and controversial endeavor, with mounting casualties, widespread destruction, and growing opposition at home. As the war dragged on, the American public became increasingly disillusioned. Graphic images of the war, broadcast on television for the first time in history, brought the brutal realities of the conflict into living rooms across the United States. Anti-war protests grew in size and intensity, with the demonstrators calling for an end to U.S. involvement. The war became a symbol of the limitations of American power and the deep divisions within U.S. society. The protest movements of the 1960s, from civil rights marches to student demonstrations, were often intertwined with opposition to the Vietnam War. For the Vietnamese people, the war was a tragedy of immense proportions. Both North and South Vietnam suffered devastating losses, with millions of civilians caught in the crossfire. Entire villages were destroyed, and vast areas of the countryside were left in ruins. The war displaced millions, creating a massive refugee crisis that would have long-lasting effects on the region. By the early 1970s, it became clear that the U.S. could not win the war through military means alone. In 1973, after years of negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, bringing an official end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. American troops withdrew, and the fighting continued between North and South Vietnam. In 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a final offensive, capturing Saigon and reunifying the country under communist control. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War, but its legacy would endure for years to come. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on the Cold War, reshaping U.S. foreign policy and shifting the global balance of power. For the U.S., Vietnam was a painful reminder of the limits of military intervention and the complexities of the Cold War. The war had drained American resources, divided the nation, and tarnished its reputation abroad. It led to a more cautious approach to foreign interventions, a period often referred to as Vietnam Syndrome, in which the U.S. hesitated to become involved in conflicts that might lead to another protracted and unpopular war. For the Soviet Union, the Vietnam War was a significant victory. Although the Soviet Union had not been directly involved in the fighting, it had provided military and economic support to North Vietnam throughout the conflict. The war demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet-backed insurgencies in challenging Western powers, and it emboldened the Soviet Union in its efforts to expand its influence in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Vietnam was just one of many proxy wars that took place during the Cold War. In places like Angola, Afghanistan, and Nicaragua, the U.S. and Soviet Union backed opposing sides, each seeking to expand its sphere of influence in the developing world. These conflicts were often brutal and devastating for the local populations, who found themselves caught in the middle of the superpower struggle. The Cold War, while often described as a cold conflict, was anything but cold for the millions of people affected by these wars. Chapter 8. Détente and the Thawing of Relations. By the late 1960s, the Cold War had reached a point of exhaustion for both the United States and the Soviet Union. After decades of brinkmanship, proxy wars, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, both superpowers began to recognize the need for a more measured approach to their rivalry. This realization gave birth to a period of relative calm and cooperation known as détente, a French word meaning relaxation or thawing. Détente marked a significant shift in Cold War dynamics, as both the U.S. and the Soviet Union sought to reduce tensions, limit the arms race, and explore opportunities for dialogue and diplomacy. The seeds of détente were sown in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and the harrowing experience left a lasting impression on the leaders of both superpowers. In the years that followed, U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev began to explore ways to avoid future crises, leading to the establishment of a direct communication line between Washington and Moscow. The famous hotline that allowed the two leaders to communicate quickly in times of crisis. However, it wasn't until the late 1960s and early 1970s that détente truly began to take shape. By this time, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were feeling the strain of their Cold War policies. The Vietnam War had become a costly and divisive conflict for the U.S., while the Soviet Union was struggling with economic stagnation and the burden of maintaining control over its Eastern European satellite states. Both nations faced internal pressures to reduce military spending and focus on domestic issues. One of the key architects of détente was U.S. President Richard Nixon, who took office in 1969. Nixon, along with his national security advisor Henry Kissinger, believed that it was possible to manage the U.S.-Soviet rivalry through a combination of diplomacy and strategic agreements. Rather than seeking to defeat the Soviet Union outright, Nixon and Kissinger aimed to establish a more stable and predictable relationship with the Soviet leadership, based on mutual respect and the recognition of each other's spheres of influence. The first major breakthrough in détente came in 1972, when Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit the Soviet Union. During his visit, Nixon met with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, and the two leaders signed a series of landmark agreements aimed at reducing the risk of nuclear war. The most important of these agreements was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT Treaty, which placed limits on the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles that each superpower could possess. While the SALT Treaty did not eliminate nuclear weapons, it marked the first time the U.S. and Soviet Union had agreed to cap their nuclear arsenals, signaling a mutual desire to avoid an unchecked arms race. In addition to the SALT Treaty, Nixon and Brezhnev also signed agreements on environmental cooperation, space exploration, and trade. These agreements reflected a broader effort to create a more constructive relationship between the two superpowers, one that went beyond military competition and sought to address common global challenges. For the first time in decades, there was a sense of optimism that the Cold War might be entering a new, less dangerous phase. Détente was not limited to U.S.-Soviet relations. It also extended to Europe, where the division between East and West remained a constant source of tension. In 1975, 35 nations, including the U.S., the Soviet Union, and nearly every European country, gathered in Helsinki, Finland for the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. The result of this conference was the Helsinki Accords, a sweeping agreement that addressed a wide range of issues, from human rights to economic cooperation to the inviolability of post-World War II borders in Europe. The Helsinki Accords were significant for several reasons. While they did not bring an end to the Cold War, they marked a formal recognition of the political status quo in Europe, with both sides agreeing to respect the existing borders. This was particularly important for the Soviet Union, which had long sought Western recognition of its control over Eastern Europe. At the same time, the accords included provisions on human rights and individual freedoms, giving dissidents in Eastern Europe a new tool to challenge the repressive regimes of their countries. Détente also had a profound impact on the broader international landscape. In 1972, just months before Nixon's visit to the Soviet Union, he made a historic trip to China, becoming the first U.S. president to visit the communist country. Nixon's visit to China was a diplomatic masterstroke, as it helped to drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and China, which had become bitter rivals in the 1960s. By opening diplomatic relations with China, Nixon created a new dynamic in the Cold War, one that allowed the U.S. to engage with both communist superpowers while exploiting the divisions between them. Despite the successes of détente, the period was not without its challenges. Hardliners on both sides remained deeply suspicious of the other's intentions, and there were moments when détente appeared to be unraveling. In the mid-1970s, the U.S. Congress grew increasingly critical of the Soviet Union's human rights record, and tensions flared over Soviet involvement in conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. In the Soviet Union, Brezhnev faced pressure from military leaders who were wary of making too many concessions to the West. The most significant blow to détente came in 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, triggering a new phase of Cold War tensions. The U.S., under President Jimmy Carter, responded by suspending arms control talks, imposing economic sanctions, and boycotting the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. The invasion of Afghanistan marked the end of the détente era, as both superpowers reverted to a more confrontational posture. Though détente ultimately faltered, it left a lasting legacy. The arms control agreements signed during this period laid the groundwork for future negotiations, and the spirit of cooperation fostered by Nixon and Brezhnev helped to pave the way for the eventual end of the Cold War. More importantly, détente demonstrated that even in the midst of ideological conflict, diplomacy and dialogue could achieve meaningful progress, reducing the risk of war and creating opportunities for peaceful coexistence. Chapter 9. Reagan, Gorbachev, and the End of the Cold War. As the 1980s began, the Cold War entered a new and uncertain phase. The period of détente that had characterized U.S.-Soviet relations in the 1970s had unraveled, replaced by renewed tensions and confrontation. The invasion of Afghanistan by Soviet forces in 1979, combined with the election of Ronald Reagan as U.S. President in 1980, signaled a shift back toward Cold War hostility. Yet, within a decade, the Cold War would come to an end, not through military might, but through diplomacy, leadership, and the winds of change sweeping across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he brought with him a deeply confrontational approach to the Soviet Union. Reagan, who had spent much of his political career warning of the dangers of communism, believed that the U.S. needed to assert its strength and challenge Soviet power more directly. He viewed the Soviet Union as an evil empire and was determined to bring it to its knees. Under Reagan's administration, the U.S. embarked on a massive military buildup, pouring billions of dollars into defense spending and accelerating the arms race. One of the most controversial aspects of Reagan's military strategy was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, often referred to as Star Wars. This ambitious plan called for the development of a space-based missile defense system that could intercept and destroy incoming Soviet missiles before they reached U.S. soil. Although the technology for SDI was far from reality, the idea sent shockwaves through the Soviet leadership, as it threatened to undermine the delicate balance of power established by mutually assured destruction. MAD. But while Reagan's early years in office were marked by a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, a new leader emerged in Moscow who would fundamentally change the course of history. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev, unlike his predecessors, was a reformer who recognized that the Soviet Union was in dire need of change. The Soviet economy was stagnating, its military spending was unsustainable, and its people were increasingly disillusioned with the communist system. Gorbachev sought to modernize the Soviet Union and ease tensions with the West. Gorbachev introduced two key policies that would define his time in power: glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost, meaning openness, was a policy aimed at increasing transparency and freedom of expression within the Soviet Union. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens were allowed to criticize the government, debate political issues, and access previously censored information. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, was Gorbachev's attempt to reform the Soviet economy by introducing elements of market competition and reducing the inefficiencies of the centrally planned system. These reforms, while groundbreaking, also unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not fully control. Glasnost emboldened dissidents in Eastern Europe and the Soviet republics, leading to a surge of demands for political freedoms and independence. Perestroika, meanwhile, struggled to deliver the economic improvements Gorbachev had hoped for, as the Soviet economy continued to deteriorate. Despite the internal challenges he faced, Gorbachev sought to reduce Cold War tensions through diplomacy with the West. In 1985, he and Reagan met for the first time at a summit in Geneva. Though the two leaders came from very different ideological backgrounds, they developed a personal rapport and began a series of negotiations aimed at reducing the nuclear threat. Over the next few years, Gorbachev and Reagan held multiple summits, each one bringing the two superpowers closer to a new understanding. The most significant breakthrough came in 1987, when Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, Treaty, a landmark arms control agreement that eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles. The INF Treaty marked the first time the U.S. and Soviet Union had agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals, rather than simply limit their growth. It was a major step toward ending the arms race and signaled a shift away from the confrontational rhetoric of the early 1980s. At the same time, Gorbachev pursued a new approach to foreign policy, one that rejected the traditional Soviet policy of maintaining tight control over Eastern Europe. In 1988, he announced that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene militarily to uphold communist regimes in Eastern Europe, a dramatic departure from the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified Soviet interventions in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. This decision had far-reaching consequences, as it gave Eastern European countries the opportunity to pursue political reforms without fear of Soviet retaliation. The collapse of communist rule in Eastern Europe happened with astonishing speed. In 1989, a wave of peaceful revolutions swept across the region, toppling communist governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. The most iconic moment of this revolutionary wave came in November 1989, when the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of Cold War division, was torn down by jubilant crowds of East and West Berliners. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet bloc and the Cold War itself. In the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's reforms had unleashed forces of nationalism and independence that he could no longer contain. By 1991, several Soviet republics, including the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, declared their independence. The Soviet Union, once the world's largest and most powerful communist state, was unraveling. The final chapter of the Cold War came in December 1991, when Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union itself was formally dissolved. The Cold War, which had dominated global politics for nearly half a century, was over. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower, while the former Soviet republics embarked on a difficult journey of independence and transition to democracy. The end of the Cold War was a momentous event, one that marked the conclusion of a long and dangerous chapter in world history. It had been a time of intense rivalry, but also of incredible resilience and diplomacy. The Cold War had shaped the modern world in countless ways, from the development of nuclear weapons to the rise of new technologies and global institutions. But in the end, it was the willingness of leaders like Reagan and Gorbachev to take risks, to engage in dialogue, and to pursue peace that made all the difference. Chapter 10. The Legacy of the Cold War. A Global Impact. Though the Cold War officially came to an end with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, its effects and legacy continue to shape the world today. From geopolitics to technological advancements, cultural shifts, and the formation of global alliances, the influence of the Cold War era is woven into the fabric of modern society. This final chapter explores the long-lasting consequences of this intense period of history and reflects on how the Cold War's legacy is still felt across the globe. One of the most significant outcomes of the Cold War was the transformation of the global political landscape. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, though rooted in ideological conflict, helped shape the creation of international institutions like the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. These institutions were initially designed to manage global conflicts and maintain a balance of power, but they continue to play central roles in global diplomacy, peacekeeping, and security. NATO, originally a military alliance created to counter the Soviet threat, has expanded its role in the post-Cold War world. It has taken on peacekeeping missions, engaged in global security operations, and provided a platform for collective defense. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO remains a powerful force in international relations, and its expansion into Eastern Europe after the Cold War has contributed to ongoing tensions with Russia. The enduring presence of NATO highlights how the alliances and structures built during the Cold War continue to shape contemporary geopolitics. The Cold War also left a deep mark on the global arms race, particularly in the development of nuclear weapons. While the threat of nuclear war has receded since the Cold War's end, the existence of nuclear weapons still poses a significant challenge for global security. The arms control agreements negotiated during the Cold War such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, Treaty, laid the foundation for ongoing efforts to manage and reduce nuclear stockpiles. However, tensions around nuclear proliferation persist, with countries like North Korea developing nuclear capabilities, and debates over arms control and non-proliferation remain central to international diplomacy. Beyond the realm of politics and military strategy, the Cold War had a profound impact on the development of technology and science. The space race, driven by competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, spurred advancements that continue to influence our world today. Satellites, space exploration, and even the foundations of modern computing were byproducts of Cold War-era innovation. The launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, and the U.S. moon landing were milestones not only in Cold War competition, but in human achievement. The space exploration programs initiated during the Cold War laid the groundwork for ongoing missions to Mars, space stations, and the future of space technology. Similarly, the Cold War spurred significant advances in military technology, much of which has found civilian applications. The development of the Internet, originally conceived as a means for secure military communication during the Cold War, has transformed the way the world connects, communicates, and conducts business. What began as a Cold War innovation has become the backbone of the global digital age, reshaping everything from commerce to social interaction. Culturally, the Cold War fostered significant shifts in the arts, media, and public consciousness. The ideological struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was not just fought on political and military fronts. It was also fought in the realms of culture and propaganda. Films, literature, and music from the Cold War era often reflected the fears and anxieties of the time, with themes of espionage, nuclear war, and the battle for ideological supremacy appearing in both Western and Eastern works. In the U.S., films like Dr. Strangelove and The Manchurian Candidate captured the dark humor and paranoia of the Cold War, while Soviet propaganda films extolled the virtues of communism and the Soviet state. Even after the Cold War, its cultural impact endures. Many modern films, television shows, and books continue to explore Cold War themes, from spy thrillers to stories of rebellion against authoritarian regimes. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the space race remain iconic historical events that are frequently revisited in popular culture, serving as reminders of a time when the world was poised on the edge of catastrophe. In many ways, the end of the Cold War also opened the door to new global challenges. The collapse of the Soviet Union created a power vacuum in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, leading to a period of political instability, economic transition, and the rise of new tensions. In Russia, the chaotic years that followed the end of communist rule gave rise to a new leadership under Vladimir Putin, whose government has sought to reassert Russian influence on the global stage. This has led to renewed tensions between Russia and the West, with echoes of Cold War rivalry resurfacing in contemporary conflicts, such as the crisis in Ukraine. The Cold War also shaped the economic development of many nations. The U.S.-led Marshall Plan, which provided economic aid to rebuild Western Europe after World War II, helped to create a foundation for the post-war economic boom in the West. In contrast, the command economies of the Soviet Union and its satellite states struggled to compete with the dynamic, capitalist economies of the West. Today, the transition from communism to capitalism in countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic has been largely successful, But other former Soviet republics continue to grapple with the challenges of economic reform and political stability. Perhaps one of the most significant legacies of the Cold War is the lesson it offers about the power of diplomacy, dialogue, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. The Cold War was a time of intense competition and fear, but it was also a period in which the superpowers ultimately found ways to avoid the worst possible outcome: nuclear war. The arms control agreements, peace negotiations, and summits that helped de-escalate tensions during the Cold War serve as a reminder that even the most intractable conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and cooperation. As we reflect on the legacy of the Cold War, we are reminded that the world we live in today has been profoundly shaped by the events of that era. The division of East and West, the rise of global institutions, the technological advancements born out of competition, all of these are products of the Cold War. Yet, despite the tensions and dangers of that time, the Cold War ended peacefully, offering hope that humanity can rise above its divisions and work toward a more peaceful, cooperative future. The end of the Cold War and its lasting legacy. As we bring this journey through the Cold War to a close, we reflect on a period of history marked by intense rivalry, profound tension, and the looming shadow of nuclear conflict. For nearly half a century, the world stood on edge as two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, engaged in a global struggle for dominance, competing not only on the battlefields of proxy wars, but also in the realms of space, technology, and ideology. And yet, despite the many moments when the world seemed on the brink of destruction, the Cold War did not end in the flash of a mushroom cloud, but in the quiet crumbling of walls and the peaceful dissolution of an empire. The Cold War, while rooted in the ideological divide between capitalism and communism, was also shaped by the individual choices of leaders, the movements of people seeking freedom, and the ever-present hope for a better, more peaceful world. It was a time of fear, but also of resilience. It was a time when humanity faced some of its greatest challenges, yet found ways to avoid the ultimate catastrophe. In the end, the Cold War was a reminder of the incredible strength of diplomacy, communication, and the desire for peace. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, followed by the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, signaled the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era in world history. The long division of Europe came to an end, and nations that had once been under the yoke of communist rule began to chart their own democratic paths. In the United States, the end of the Cold War was greeted with relief, but also with the recognition that the challenges of the post-Cold War world would be different, but no less complex. For Russia and the former Soviet republics, the end of the Cold War marked the beginning of a difficult transition, as they struggled to find their place in a rapidly changing world. The legacies of the Cold War: economic instability, political upheaval, and lingering tensions would continue to shape global politics for years to come. And even today, the echoes of the Cold War can still be heard in the conflicts and challenges that define our modern world. As we look back on the Cold War, we see not just the dangers and divisions, but also the moments of triumph, innovation, and progress. The space race, once a competition for supremacy, led to remarkable achievements in science and technology. The arms control agreements of the Deant era laid the foundation for future disarmament efforts, and the peaceful revolutions that swept across Eastern Europe in the late 1980s showed that even the most entrenched regimes could fall when faced with the will of the people. In the end, the Cold War was a complex and multifaceted period of history, one that tested the limits of human endurance and creativity. It was a time of great danger, but also of great hope. And while the Cold War is now behind us, its lessons about the importance of diplomacy, the dangers of unchecked rivalry, and the need for global cooperation remain as relevant as ever.